In the studio now, Reza Pahlavi. Many thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Now, first of all, let's start with events in Iran yesterday. The reformist movement did try to use those large public gatherings to mark the anniversary of the Islamic Revolution to get their grievances across. Security forces clamped down on them very, very quickly. Is this a worrying sign that security forces are becoming more adept at stamping out opposition protest before it even gets off the ground?
Well, of course, the regime is going to use every tactic possible to repress the opposition, to the point of not even tolerating media presence and carefully orchestrated events, as we witnessed yesterday. This is the kind of reaction that was obviously anticipated by the people and the opposition. And as you know, there's always a sort of a cat and mouse game happening. The degree of repression will not decrease. The real question, however, is how many within the coercive forces will indefinitely be capable or willing to cooperate with the regime, as opposed to refuse to carry out such orders and join with the people. We are already witnessing some hesitation and some crackdown, not only within the regime, but of coercive forces that have refused to, in fact, beat up on people, and they really had to have recourse to what we call lebas shakhsi, or people who are dressed in civilian clothes.
So security forces who are refusing to follow orders?
We have seen cases where they have restrained themselves from actually hacking down too hard, not necessarily yesterday, but over the past few months. It's indicative that there is a sense of conscience and guilt within those forces. And, you have to understand that the demand of people today is well beyond any hope of this regime reforming itself. The movement is gradually turning towards a much more fundamental expectation, which is finding a solution beyond this regime within a sort of secular democratic alternative.
So you want to do away with the theocracy altogether, rather than reform, as the movement of Musavi says he wants to reform the government,
yes,
willing to engage with the government.
There are some who still may believe that there's still a possibility to reform, but I think the majority of the people have given up on that thought. It was attempted several years ago. It has failed for two reasons. A, because the regime's nature simply prohibits it. Two, because the vehicles that could bring any kind of legislation that could modify the law simply does not exist or is not allowed by the regime. So how could you possibly reform it?
But under the last president, President Khatami, he was a moderate president. Did life not get better for ordinary people under Iran? Is that not an alternative to a complete overthrow of the regime? As we saw when your father was overthrown, thousands of people died in that revolution. Is there a risk that overthrowing the regime would prove to be a repeat of that?
First of all, the numbers were much less that you indicated in terms of the transition that was rather smooth, only because the coercive forces in fact remained neutral that facilitated the transition. Such a scenario could be anticipated in the next change, because part of what I sort of call for in the process of change, which is based on nonviolent civil disobedience, has to take into consideration the crucial role that coercive forces can play in that transition. The bottom line is they need to find survival beyond this regime, and the fact that society will accept them back into their fold. That can easily be placed in terms of giving them those assurances and guarantees, because we're not only talking about change of regime, we're talking about a transition a la South Africa, where you also deal with a general amnesty and national reconciliation. I think
we could be talking about regime change a la Iraq, which has not been quite so
successful. Because it was done by foreign forces, whereas in Iran it has the hand of the people themselves internally. That's the big difference.
Okay, let's talk about the power of the international community then, foreign forces. President Ahmadinejad has become increasingly isolated in the international community. The West is calling for tougher and harder sanctions against his regime. You don't believe that's the right way to go, though?
Well, my trend of thought is basically to invite the international community to understand that so long as you're going to deal with the system within the boundaries of a status quo, even sanctions in and of themselves will not prove to be sufficient in the long run. And also the fact that sanctions in and of itself will have a tendency to also affect the society and population itself, and not just the regime. I believe that the world should, the same way they've decided to put an end to apartheid in South Africa, say enough is enough. This regime can no longer be acceptable, tolerable. In fact, there was a letter published, I believe it was printed in the New York Times initially, by 40 Nobel laureates calling on world leaders to put an end to this. And I think the international opinion is in that direction. Governments need to adjust to this reality. There has to be an active support for the Iranian people who deserve to have the solidarity with the outside world to achieve their end, to ask for free elections to determine their own future. I think that's a direction where you will find that then sanctions may be meaningful, because at the end of the day, we have a fundamental change as opposed to just punitive measures to isolate the regime even more.
Okay, now I'd like to ask you, two members of an outlawed monarchist group were executed last month. They were actually arrested before the election in Iran, before Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was re-elected. Why do you think the regime has gone after members of this somewhat marginal monarchist group rather than going after the hardline reformists?
Well, I think they sense a serious threat because they know that in the psyche of the Iranian nation, the institution that has existed for centuries has a great role to play, and they feel most threatened, particularly by that tendency. As a matter of fact, anybody associated itself as a monarchist or as one of my supporters will immediately carry the death penalty just for being a supporter. So not that the regime is discriminating, it is indiscriminating towards any of its opponent, but they are particularly sensitive to that, and as we saw in the case has been evidenced in recent months, unfortunately.
I'd like to end, if you'll permit me. Some of your critics might say someone who hasn't lived in Iran for many years is not the best person to judge what's best for the people of Iran. How would you respond to that?
Well, I think that the principles that I'm advocating are principles that have been universally pursued by so many societies and nations when it comes to human rights, when it comes to self-determination, when it comes to equality under the law, when it comes to putting an end to any kind of discrimination. I don't think it has anything to do with whether or not you have been physically in a country or not. I have been in touch with my fellow compatriots even though I was geographically separated, because for 30 years Iran has been my life, day and night. So I think I've been quite connected. I'm certainly quite aware of what's happening. I certainly have been solicited by many inside and outside. And the only role that I intend to play, and I have said this, is to help this movement get to a point that we can finally conduct free elections and have a referendum on the question of whether we want this regime or not, and if not, then opt for what I think is the solution for the country, a parliamentary democracy based on the principle of secularism, meaning the clear separation between religion and government, which is to me a fundamental prerequisite to democratic order.
Okay, Reza Pahlavi, I'll have to stop you there, but many thanks indeed for joining us.